Be optimistic. Yes, we're recording this. I'm trying to be optimistic. 3 days ago, 2 days ago, it was minus 10. Yesterday was minus 7. Today it's plus 1. So instead of saying how cold it is, I said, we're on a warming trend. You got to see the positive in everything, I think, which is one of the things that comes for a seeker of silence is you begin to see the positive while everybody else is seeing the negative, including COVID and its seemingly keeping us away from a busier, more normal life. But I am going to be doing some pre-Lenten teaching for those old timers. You remember we used to talk about Septuagesima, Sexagesima, and Quinquagesima as 70, 60, and 50 days before Lent, because 40 days is a more modern way of Lenten practice. But in the old days, when people were tougher, they began to prepare 70 days before. So I'm trying to toughen up you people and myself. And so I'm going to be giving 2 Wednesday talks at 2 p.m. my time, 4 yours, on the East Coast on February 9th and 23rd on reflections. I'm calling them Septuagesima reflections. And so that'll be 2 p.m. On Mountain Time. And so you're invited to that. And then a couple of the monks are going to be doing some things on the Wednesdays of Lent. I'll be doing Ash Wednesday. I'm not sure which of the other ones will be doing what, but so we're trying to line up some things. But today have more reflections on Jesus and those, I guess you might call them the silent years, what they might have been like, his preparations. And a way of looking at not only our own lives, but what his might have been like. I think sometimes we forget, we say it in our creeds and our faith, he was truly human. But then we kind of blow that off and say he couldn't be anything like us. But it says he was everything like us except in sin, which means he didn't know a lot of things. And he had to discover a lot of things because that's what human is. That's what a seeker of silence is all about. We don't know it all, but we're growing sometimes just by trying things. So an image that I have of his days, the so-called his silent years, they were only silent to us. But an image that I have is something that really struck me, and I'm modifying it a little bit, but it was from Catherine de Hewitt Doherty, who you don't hear much about, but she was a buddy of Dorothy Day, who you hear a lot about. But they were both involved in some of the same things, which was caring for the poor, interested in justice, and quite contemplative. She wrote several books, and I think one was Molchani. She has these words, Pustinia, Molchani, Sobernost. I guess they're Russian words for whatever. But the Molchani, I think, was more about silence. And whether she made up this image or she got it from somebody else, doesn't matter. But it works for me. And we were just talking about Florida. So think about being barefoot, okay? And walking around on brambles and broken branches and stones, and it really hurts. And suddenly you see this sand, and you put your feet in the warm sand, not the super hot sand like July, but warm sand. You sink your feet into the sand. Right now, all you've done is taken off your shoes and whatever stocking things you have on, and it feels so good, much better than those brambles and such. And then you see the water, and you decide, well, I'm going to go down and just stand in the water up to my ankles or calves. Well, you got to lift up a few more clothes, or maybe have on shorts or whatever. But the idea is you remove things, and you then stand in that. And then the ocean invites you to just jump in, which of course you would have to be completely stripped, and and you're sort of ready to jump in, but you can't do it on your own. You have to be somehow energized by something else to get you to jump fully in. It's sort of, you haven't done it before, so you sort of wait. So that until you jump in. So what is struck as life, often without any spirituality, is like trying to walk around barefoot. Jesus did a lot of barefoot as well as sandals, trying to walk around barefoot on rocky, stony tree roots, broken branches and everything. And it's very uncomfortable. Life can be very uncomfortable, just one misery after the other. Just difficult to get around. And it kind of grabs you and gets hold of you, and you're in a kind of not so good mood. And someone says, why don't you practice a little meditation? Life is difficult and all. And that's like the sand. You go and you stand in the sand, and all you have to do is just remove a little bit. The idea that shoes or stockings, what you remove is your super busyness of life and all your miseries, and you just stand for a little bit. And it feels so good to just be still for a moment. And even people who say, I find it very difficult to be still and in silence. Well, I always suggest just do it for a little bit until you get comfortable day by day. So you stand in that sand and it feels pretty comfortable. And but something beckons you to go back. Busyness of life, all the things you have to do, but you just stand in the sand. Now, not immediately, but maybe you do go back and forth until eventually you can just stand in the sand, which is a little bit like meditating, being quiet, not paying much attention to your mind, but you're still aware of thoughts, but they're not quite dominating you. So in other words, it feels pretty good. And then this invitation is to, why don't you go deeper? Why don't you just let go of even some of these good thoughts, and you enter into a deeper silence. But you're aware that it's a deeper silence. I often have that. It's silent or still, and I'm aware of it. But there's an invitation to go even deeper. And that's going into the ocean. But you have to strip yourself of all desire to stay connected and contacted with your mind and your feelings and all the things that people want from you or you think you're wanted. And you just have to let it go. Don't pay any attention to even the nice silence that you were feeling, and let God take you into the ocean and become one with it. And I think the difference that I got out of that idea and is, for a while, you are aware of the silence, the stillness, the presence, ultimate reality, but you haven't become it yet. I think when you're taken into the ocean of God's love, which only God can really do, but you have to be at least standing in the water. So you have to have a practice. If God chooses to take you in, that's when you'll experience non-duality. Now, you may not experience at the moment you're in the ocean, but when you're in the ocean, when you're in the physical ocean, you really can't see much that's going on the shore or any place else. Matter of fact, you're probably not even concerned about it. You're just in the ocean. But But when you come out of that deep place, you become the presence for others. And this is how I think it will be exhibited. You went from, first you had, your life was a little bit messy and so on and so on. So you practice meditation, your life gets kind of better, more still and quieter. And, some of your attitudes change. We'll get into more of that. And I think this is some of the things that were happening with Jesus. He was beginning to discover, when you come out of the ocean of God's love, you become the presence. You exhibit it to others without even trying. So two things happen. You are now able to go back onto the brambles of life, but they no longer hurt. Why? Because you don't have, they don't affect you and effect you the way they used to. Because you're able to put up with the same people, places, and situations, but they don't bring out as much of the same thoughts and feelings and none of the action that you used to have towards them. That's the one thing. So that's how you are more aware of your change. But what you're not so aware of, but other people will be aware of is the way you are. And without even saying things, you will be a certain kind of person. Make people look twice. There's just something about you that attracts them. And you might have met a person like that. I think Thomas Keating was that way for me in particular. Whenever you say, I had a great teacher, it wasn't just what the teacher said, although they said good things. It was something about the teacher. They weren't just talking about something they had read. They had become part of it and talking about it. You pick that up. And I think that's what Jesus was becoming. Well, in other words, he already is, but he has to discover it, just as we already are one with the divine, ultimate reality, the source, the power, in my tradition, God. But we don't know that at this point, okay? We're just not aware of it because we're sort of taken up with all the things of life that have dominated us, and the whole culture says that we should be focused on those things out there. And a lot of people say, "Oh, you just go off and contemplate, and you'll be a useless human being." And I'm sure that some people thought about that with Jesus. In other words, he lived in a compound. We have this idea of everybody living in their separate little homes near each other. That's not how they lived back then. They lived in compounds, and whether he had brothers or sisters, whatever, he had relatives, and they all lived in the same kind of area, maybe even somewhat enclosed. And their animals lived right with them, more or less. They didn't live out in a barn or out in a place that's all fenced off. They sort of lived right with them. They didn't have domesticated horses or anything like that. They had, farmish type animals, I guess, chickens and that sort of thing. Well, not pigs because they're Jews. But in any case, he lived a rather noisy life, if you will. So he's not this only child living in his own room and he's all by himself with his solitude and silence. No, he lived with a bunch of people. And what he would do, I suspect, because he did it in the Gospels, is he would just take off and go and out into the hills, which were nearby. They didn't have suburbia, if you will. So he would just go out and be in the hills by himself, maybe a cave, a lot of caves there. So he might have been in a cave. He just found a place where he could be silent and still. And it was in that, I think, that he discovered that he was the ocean, if you will. And he called that relationship Father. All right. You can call it whatever you want. He called it Father. And it worked for him. And he had a sense of being one with, and he wanted to tell people about it. But first he had to be it, because if he wasn't what he was talking about, he wouldn't have attracted followers. He would have just been thought as a nutcase, maybe. Kingdom of God is in your midst. What the heck's that all about? But if they see something about him, they say, well, maybe there's something about what he's saying because there's something about him. So gradually this change from whatever everybody knew him as, because they, those closest to him thought he was insane. He was crazy because he was not what they had known him as earlier. So had they always known him as this spiritual guru, bringing back to life little birdies when he was 4 years old and stuff like that, they probably would have gotten used to him being extraordinary, but he wasn't. He was ordinary to them. And then the transformation came as he pursued it. He was a seeker of silence, but it wasn't to stay silent. It was he was a seeker of silence. And what came out of that was he became the message, but he could also talk about the message. And I think that that depth of silence, there is a depth of silence. For some of us, we may, something close to that would be, infused contemplation versus active contemplation of Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila talked about active contemplation, which would be a deep silence, but not the deepest. Infused would be the deepest. And she was another one, practiced that, and then she went about her business, and a lot of people thought she was crazy and they didn't like her. Well, a lot of people thought Jesus was crazy and didn't like him. And that may be the result of you being involved in the same life as before, but differently. You bring something different to it. A lot of people will be attracted, and some will think you're crazy and just a pain in the neck. Well, that's what following Jesus Christ is going to be all about for you Christians. I'm sure there's a few people think I'm a nutcase for being up here in the monastery. Why aren't I blah, 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 doing whatever they were used to me doing, just as those who, when I said I was going to pursue priesthood, thought I was nuts. Actually, I think I was, but I did it anyway. And it turned out to be a good idea. So I keep that in mind about Jesus, and his formation, if you will, had to come pretty directly from this relationship with God, who he called Father. And he had been down to the temple. We know that from when he was 12 and he stayed at the temple. So we know that he went to Jerusalem. We know that he had the experience of God in a place, which is very much what we have, especially in the Catholic tradition with the Holy Eucharist, that you find Jesus by going to a place, the church building, and there you can look at him there in the tabernacle. But the idea that he is within you, every place you are, and it's the same God, just people can't get a hold of that at all. Well, they don't have any experience of it personally. It's just, that's the way it is for so many people. So I'm going to think you're a little bit nuts. So Jesus did jobs that he could get as he could get them. And when you think about it, if he was if people had any sense that Mary got pregnant without Joseph, then they would look askance as Jesus, as well as Mary. So maybe if they were all super judgmental, he might have had a tough time getting some work. But he did what he could do with carpentry, house building. He probably went out into the boats with the disciples and helped them sometimes with fish. So the idea that he was walking along and said to Peter, come follow me, and Peter never met him before, is a bunch of baloney. I think Peter knew who he was. and was watching what was going on. And Jesus knew the right timing, just as he knew the right timing to get up and go and proclaim his good news. And because people say, why didn't he do it sooner? Because he knew it wasn't ready to be done sooner. The seekers of silence, it takes a long time. People often say, how long does it take to become a monk? Some say 20, 30 years. Keating might have said that. Any case, it just takes a long time to become all that God made you to be from creation. So just keep working at it. What I think that he became, God becoming human is a tremendous act of love. Because we read in the Hebrew scriptures, that is before Jesus' time, before the incarnation, we read about being the bride of Christ. You read about all over the scriptures, we're the bride of Christ. Well, it'd be nice if the groom was flesh and blood, like we are. And I think that God became flesh so that we really could have a much more intimate, if you would, expression of us being the bride to God, the groom. And the groom made himself ready over years to be the groom. So we need to make ourselves ready over years to be the bride. So it takes a little bit of time. Because what we're trying to do is for the two to become one flesh. Don't we say that in our marriage talks, two become one flesh? Well, why are we going to Holy Communion, Catholics? We're trying to become one in our flesh with the body and blood of Jesus Christ, of God. So it's an attempt for God to use the things of the world, bread, wine, to help us who are enfleshed people to experience the oneness that can go ever deeper in the contemplative life. In other words, going to Holy Communion in itself is not going to transform you, but it's part of the journey. And we certainly have met a lot of people who go to daily mass and they don't exhibit Christ all that well. And others do. And I suspect that they have a deeper life besides their Eucharistic practice. So there is another way of looking at this deeper silence, I think, is there's a wall. In other words, I think we can practice up to a point in our practice and have an experience. It's graced, but we can see ourselves participating in the grace. So you call it actual grace, if you will, if you want to go look in your catechisms. And we participate in God's power and energy so that our prayer life, our silence deepens. We get a better sense as we're walking around during the day of the presence of God in our lives and so on and so forth. We begin to have different attitudes towards problematic situations, the brambles of life. But there's a wall in this silence beyond which we cannot go by our own efforts. We have to wait. And we have to wait upon God. And that becomes God's total ultimate choice. Now, I think just the fact that you're practicing any sort of deepening meditation and getting any results is part of God's choice, but you realize you got some active part to do with it too. I mean, you're showing up. But this deep silence beyond this wall is a silence so deep that you're not, as we have read, you're not even aware of it at the time. But it is the transforming silence And when God chooses to bring it, God chooses to bring it. And why would God bring you into the ocean of that deepest silence? I suspect it's because God has plans for you. And those plans, if you want to go back to Jesus Christ, could involve some suffering. And we may have an instinct, we don't really want to go beyond that wall because we don't want the cross. But if God takes you, there's got to be something in you that was willing to out of your love for God to participate in whatever cross there might be afterwards. I'm reading something. Ghislaine Miller will be jumping out of her chair. A Carmelite named Elizabeth of the Trinity, who has certainly been eclipsed by Therese of Lisieux. They died within 10 years of each other. They both attended French Carmels. They're both Carmelites. Therese died at 24, and Elizabeth at 26, both of diseases. And so I've read Therese of Lisieux, but now I'm reading this particular book, Always Believe in Love. Now, some might find this a little saccharine. If you do, then you're not ready to read this book. But it's the selected writings of her put out by the Carmelites, ICS. That's what the organization is called. And, I know God's at work because I've heard about this woman here and there over a period of time, but something drew me to start reading her now. And so I am. And what I get out of it is not, oh, Lord, thank you. There's someone else on the same path as me. It's no, what I get out of it is my love is so tepid relative to Elizabeth of the Trinity because she is ready to suffer whatever God wants. And because her whole love is for God. She was a good looking young lady, very talented, pianists. And her mother didn't want her to go in. She wouldn't let her go in until she was 21. So at 21, she went in, 26, she's dead. But what I'm getting out of it is just what's happening. And this woman's in her early 20s. I was an idiot. I'm not much better now, but I was an idiot. She's totally in love with God and ready. Well, go back to the wall of silence. I think when you're taken beyond that wall, it's because God knows that you're ready for whatever's going to happen. And I think that's what it was with Jesus. You said, how did he know that there was going to be a cross there? Well, how did Elizabeth of the Trinity know? And remember, Jesus didn't really start his thing till he was about 30. You just know, all right? But you're abandoning yourself. When you're taken into the ocean, you have abandoned yourself to God's will. And that's a big step. And I don't think God will take you on through that step until God knows you're ready. So, but when God knows you're ready, you'll be ready. Jesus, I think, surrendered. And we see this on the cross. He again says it, into your hands I commend my spirit. So this is what he's been doing in his public life. And how he got there was in his before public life, that he's letting himself little by little surrender because he's got to let go of everybody's expectations of him, as well as what he did for a living. There's nothing that says he built tables while he was out on his mission. Nothing at all. Matter of fact, said, I have no place to lay my head. He eats wherever anybody will feed him. So we can say those words, and hopefully during Lent, we can begin to say them a little bit better. Into your hands I commend my spirit. That's what Good Friday is all about in the Gospel of John. And I think when you get beyond this wall of silence, if God takes you there, And I'm pretty optimistic that it can happen. There won't be much thinking. You're beyond thinking or thinking about not thinking. It's just there may be an emotion, maybe all emotion, such as just a great sense of overwhelming love. That's an emotion. And isn't it the Buddha who says thinking won't lead you to your true origins? Well, go back and think. I mean, how do we get introduced to a belief system? Thinking. People teach you dogma and doctrine and rules and regulations and so on and so forth. Well, that's how it starts out. I mean, Jesus had to be taught about the Torah, and he had to be able to read. And that's another thing I think we have to keep in mind, that in his culture, his Jewish culture, for the men anyway, the reading was important. And I like those images that the church has of Mary at the Annunciation, which shows her with a book. That it was okay for women to read too, and to learn to read. In other words, literacy was important, because without literacy, you can't really read the Word of God. And the sense was not only you can read it, but with some guidance, you can understand it. Well, Western Christianity didn't develop that way. It was hugely illiterate. European Christianity, which was the kind we got over here with the invaders, or whatever you want to call when we all came over here from Europe to discover America, we couldn't read and write. And so my church didn't have you doing any of this stuff. They just sort of told you what to do, gave you a couple of rules and regs, and you went around relatively ignorant. But for Jesus' time, my church said, don't bother reading the Bible because you can't understand it. Well, Jesus was very much into the literacy of it, reading it. So you start there. It makes sense, but it's not the be all and the end all. At some point, you got to let go of all your thinking. It's not as if you forget, but you let it go and you stop talking about it and become it. That's the difference, talking about it and becoming it. So you get beyond that wall and you become. So Jesus is discovering himself as divine. And we call it divinization. We taught, especially in the Orthodox Church, it says we are God. Augustine, I think, says that too. Well, in other words, there's non-duality. If somebody would say, well, let's look at that scientifically, are you and God exactly the same? Well, no, but yes. See, when you get beyond non-duality, that thinking, that dichotomous way of thinking begins to all fall apart. So we are the presence, if you will, when we come out of the ocean of God's love. And meditation, which we're trying to practice today and deepening it, it got dropped from classical education. In other words, we didn't have studying the classics with meditation. We just said studying the classics. So you read the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, the classics, Greek classics. And without a meditative life, Odysseus is just, taking a time to get home, however, 10 years, whatever number of years it takes. But with a meditative life, and of course, there was no Jesus when this was being written. It wasn't looking at it from a Jewish perspective, but it was looking at it from a spiritual perspective. It wasn't just a story about a guy trying to get home from a war. It's a story about the contemplative life, trying to get home to God, if you will, and all the things that get in the way. Is that not our meditation practice? All the things that get in the way of our spiritual growth. And so each of his little side trips, when you can look at it from a meditative point of view, make a whole lot of difference. It's not just a story, but it's really the story of becoming all God meant us to be. And I think that's what Homer might have had in mind. So another way of looking at this in terms of Jesus' life is drinking of the Spirit. Well, it's hard to drink ice. What you want is the refreshing waters of the Spirit. Come to me, all you who thirst. I'm not going to give you an ice cube and ask you to swallow that. So what comes, I think, with the silence, whichever side of the wall you're on, but most of us, you're on the side where you're still aware. You know, it's not the deepest. What happens is the icy heart or stony heart is another way of looking at it. But in this metaphor with come to me, oh, you are thirsty, it's the icy heart that melts and discovers the refreshing waters of God that's always been there. And that's how we drink of the Spirit. A lot of people think, oh, the Spirit comes down into us like a bird. No, the Spirit is already within us, but it's kind of squeezed in the center of our heart because it's surrounded by all our anxieties and fears and anxieties and worries. It's kind of imprisoned to the Spirit, if you will. And those are the things we begin to let go of with the contemplative practice. So the Spirit is just ready to flourish. It needs a little bit of space. Back to my little friend, Elizabeth of the Trinity, wants to go into the cell of her heart, maybe the cell of her soul, I can't remember, but this, you know, the desert monks say, sit in your cell and a cell will teach you everything. And immediately we run to go to a room. Okay, that's okay for starters. Go sit in a quiet place and stop running around. But eventually you realize that's not the cell they're talking about. They're talking about the center of yourself, the depth where that Spirit lives, and it'll teach you everything that you need to know. So you start out sitting in an enclosed space so that you can get deeper down, letting go of all these anxieties and worries and fears. There'll be a lot to learn with that letting go so that we can, boom, discover that presence within us, and that'll shine the light on. This is who you are. And I've got stuff for you to do, if you will, whatever that is. Now you say, well, this little Elizabeth of the Trinity only lived to be 26. She was a big letter writer. That's something we don't do anymore. But she wrote stuff, and people saved it. They thought, hey, this is pretty good stuff. We think we'll save it. So she did what she did as best as she could do it, because she had given herself totally to God at a very young age nowadays, since we seem to live so long, many of us. So we get things to melt. One of the things I've learned this winter, for instance, maybe it's because all the animals are underground or hiding out or just trying to find a way to stay warm. And the birds are, well, they're still around eating, but they're not making too much noise either. And there's no leaves on the trees to blow. So when I'm going out for these winter walks, and well, maybe not when it's 10 below. I may be crazy, but not that crazy. So, but when it gets a little warmer, like 20, and I go out for a walk on one of our roads here in this big ranch, and I'll just stop. I mean, once I stopped, I don't know for what, tie a shoe or something. And all of a sudden it hit me. the profound silence that is all around me. It's a much deeper silence than a city or a town has. There's no humming of transformers or wires or air conditioners or heaters or anything like that. And I was in an area where there actually it didn't matter if there were trees because there were no leaves blowing, no birds making any noise because that particular place wasn't any tree anyway. And the profound depth of silence. And I realized this is the presence of God all around me in this deep silence. I just wanted to stand there. And I did. And I realized that nature is active. You know, if you read that book Overstory about trees, underground, all the roots, they're all chatting away with one another, but they're not making any noise. So it wasn't until us animated creatures, birds and animals and people came along, which that noise happened. That really there is a profound silence that goes on in Mother Nature, if you will, and we're invited. It surrounds us, just as it was surrounding me on that path, and it says, "Enter into me. You are in me. Just become aware of being in the silence." And I think that's what can happen in our contemplative practice. Even if there is some noise around you, those who have a method learn to not pay attention to it, but you begin more and more. And I think this is what happened to Jesus. More and more, he realized the depth. He got away from his little village of chatting away and animals making noise and so on and so forth. He went out up into the hills. Whatever attracted him, it's the same stuff that attracted you to become a person of meditation, a seeker of silence, if you will. And that's how you're going to hear. It says at his baptism, for instance, he hears a voice. God's voice, "You are my beloved son." Well, actually, you can read that in the Hebrew scriptures. There's that phrase, "You are my beloved son." And Jesus heard that because he was not making noise. And you said, well, nobody else heard it. Well, he heard it in the depths of his interior silence. And it's reinforcing who he is and has always been. And now he's really discovering it. And this is when he's at the beginnings. He probably did some things in Nazareth before he came to see John the Baptist, because John had a sense of who he was. Not completely, but that he was the Messiah. But then what you have to keep in mind, and right after that, he's led out into the desert by the tempter. And what we have to realize is when we sense the presence or the voice of God, if you will, which is silence, stillness, and yet communicating, there's going to be another voice, and it's a louder voice. And that's the voice of the tempter. And the tempter is saying, get off that path, Terry Ryan. That is no good. I'll show you what's a good path. Power, control, esteem, security. The things that Keating talked about as programs for happiness. That's not going to work. But that's what being led into the desert by a louder voice. And who leads him into the desert? That very same spirit. To say, here's your competition. Here's my competition, is what God is saying. Who are you going to follow? And what we find out in our contemplative practice is, I'm sitting here all the time and I still have all these problems. Well, you'll continue to have all these problems as long as you continue to let the voice of those problems dominate your day. As I have. So I'm not speaking out of a book. This is my own personal experience as well. That voice is there every day, trying as loud as possible to say, Terry, you are wasting your time in that monastery. You got to get going to do this, that, and the other thing. So that's the temptation in the desert. Get off this path, because this path is going to show you who you truly are. The path of the tempter is going to show you, if you would, who the culture wants you to be. So now we're still somewhat close to New Year's, since it's early February. And if you had made a New Year's resolution, remember the louder voice of the tempter is saying, oh, no, blow that off. And many people do in the first couple of weeks, because they don't have the wherewithal to change. You can't change because you want to change. It's got to be a power greater than yourself, as they say in 12-step programs. You got to have help, because you're just too entrenched. And Jesus realized that. The culture was saying this, and he felt he was being led. And it took him a long time to get that all worked out, if you will. So which voice are you going to follow? You follow the voice of God, you'll have the cross. You know, if you follow the voice of the tempter, it'll be a different cross, but you'll be miserable. But this will be a cross that will come. The cross that comes with that deeper silence, when you become a little bit more of the silence. But even before that, just your meditative practice, is the cross of being a giver and not a taker. One of the things about going back to that, my original image of standing in the sand doesn't change because you're standing there. You're a complete getter. You're getting warmed. You're giving nothing to the sand, okay? But that's okay. That's where you are. And I tell people, don't get upset, because at least you're not back in the brambles trying to do life all by yourself in misery. So for a while, you just get from God. God's not asking a whole lot early on. I mean, if anybody said, listen, start meditating, and the second day you're going to have a cross. Not a good way to get people going. You'll get the cross when you're ready to handle the crosses that God has you for, but you'll get the crosses of culture very early on as you battle trying to have more power, more prestige, more control, and more security. It's all more, and there'll be a lot of pain and suffering for that. And is that really the way you want to go? So you're invited to follow the voice of God and get God's cross, not your culture's cross. And so meditation, the practice of meditation, the seeking, is really ignoring the voice inviting you into the culture's way or into the desert. But it is a desert. If you try to have your own programs for happiness, it's empty. So what you begin to understand is that the kingdom is in your midst. Where did we get that? Well, that's what Jesus started talking about. He says, wait a second. The kingdom is in our midst. Now, some say the kingdom is within you. Now, some say that was a bad translation. Okay. The kingdom is in your midst, which means it's in you as well. But in your midst means it's available to everybody. We got caught up in the Reformation in the West, and we got started fighting with other Christian groups. The kingdom is only for us and not for you. We're going to kill you or burn you. Certainly not give you communion. We'll punish you one way or the other. You prods want to marry us Catholics? We're going to make it hard. I don't think Jesus had anything to do with that. He went out and talked to Gentiles, and he didn't get that right away. It took him a while to figure that one out. And the grace of that came from a Gentile woman. So the kingdom is in your midst. It's for everyone. That's very Zen. Very Zen. But just because it's in your midst and available to everyone doesn't mean that you'll enjoy it. it just says it is. Now you got to practice getting out of the way with your stuff so that you can enjoy the kingdom. So this whole idea, you'll hear about this some in Lent, I guess, repent. When you get your ashes, it's repent and believe in the good news. A lot of people say, Lent, I'm going to change my bad habits. Come Holy Week, you got the same bad habits, okay? You didn't change them. You might have given up something for 40 days, which is just another ego trip. And really, I don't think giving up chocolate for Lent is going to lead to you becoming one with the ocean of love. That hasn't worked for me. So it's not so much about changing bad habits. I think some bad habits, some a little bit of addictive temptations is actually, it's a grace. As long as you're not practicing them much. It's a grace because what it does is it keeps us humble and keeps us from judging others. This is what I found. I'll get on a nice roll and I won't do some dumb thing that I do here and there. And I'll say, gee, I haven't done that in weeks. I'm really on a roll. And then I do. And you know what happens first? Your ego. Because you say, oh man, I'm so bad. I'm so guilty. You feel so guilty, so ashamed. And a lot of that is, I should have been better than that. I'm evolved spiritually. And what you realize is you've been developing false pride. You haven't every day said, Lord, help me. Without you, I can do nothing. No, you got on a roll and you maybe even stopped some of the practice that you were doing that was part of your humility from your last fall, your last mess up. You say, I'm not going to get angry about this. And then you blow up. And a lot of it's false pride. I shouldn't have done that. Well, the two things that happen, one, humility, and you stop judging others because you realize, hey, I'm still a jerk in some ways. Why am I judging that person? Why am I thinking I'm better than them? So I think God gives us what Paul called thorn in the side. So I don't know that Jesus was saying, stop doing all these things. He said, start loving. Practice loving, I think is what he was talking about, which needs an attitude adjustment because you're not going to love people you look down your nose at and start seeing things in a new way. Recognize how powerless you are to get over your bad habits left to your own devices, but how much can come from humility and trying to be loving. That's when you get out of the sand and you get into the shallow waters. You move a little bit from being a taker to being a giver. And I think we see that in our, you might have been a giver before you ever contemplated. But this is a depth of giving because it has a sense of relationality with the divine and the depth of love that is within you and all around you. So you move little by little. And I think this is what's going to make community better, is you can never have community with takers. There have to be givers. And we become a giver. And what does it do? It builds connectivity. The sense of oneness with God, or the sense of non-duality with God, builds into non-duality with others who we used to criticize because of the depth. Maybe got beyond that wall of silence. So it's about seeing in a new way. And sometimes seeing some things for the first time, I think is what begins to happen. Most of the time we're told what to see. And that makes for prejudice and judgment. That person over there doesn't look like you, doesn't speak like you, doesn't have your economic status, have nothing to do with them. That's how prejudice gets involved. We start making separations, and And what happens? We just want to be around people who look like us. Well, it's a singular journey, this contemplative practice, in many ways. That's what Jesus realized. He looking around. Who's like me? He ain't not finding too much of it. It was, oh, Mary was just like Jesus. Well, nobody's just like Jesus. And maybe she was a lot like Jesus. I mean, she was at the foot of the cross. He was concerned about his mother. But by and large, he felt kind of a singular character, but yet he invited others to come on the journey with him. He wasn't going to do it all by himself. So he sees what is within him, and he sees the possibility that's in others, which means he is seeing non-duality even before they do. So he sees Peter's possibilities for changing even before Peter does. And we can see what a jerk Peter is in the Gospels. And then in the Acts of the Apostles, there's this change starting to happen. Jesus saw that. And I think that's the invitation that he has to each one of us in contemplative practice. He sees, God sees in each one of us the non-duality that we can't see yet. So we have to trust that it's there. So Jesus is entering into what you might call a borderless solidarity. It's beyond being Jewish. But he was Jewish, but he had a connectivity with what isn't. So you can identify with a culture and a religion, but it cannot put a wall around us. So the solitude that we have is so that we can hear the depth of that more silent voice than the tempter's voice. So we can see in a new way, literally see the silence without judgment, without comparison. And that's what will begin to the change. So sometimes it'll feel like a desert. You know, I'm all by myself in this. But it's the interior desert that will begin to bring it out. So you have to be a little bit empty, like a seeming desert, to be open to God. And we've been watching something here, a BBC thing, but National Geographic does the same things, in which you look, they'll show a far distant aerial view of it, where they say, this is a desert, nothing there. And then when they get closer, they find out all kinds of things are there. And people live in that desert and they survive. And so just because it seems like a desert and not Disney World, doesn't mean there's nothing there. So continue to practice. My gosh, we've been at this an hour. We only have 15 people. I might be a has-been. Any case, we're going to let's take a 10-minute break. All right. I'm going to get one of my cookies, and I don't have to turn on the oven yet. I'm making pizza for these guys today. Then we're going to come back and do a 20-minute sit and see if we have any comments or Q&A. Okay. So it's 9:30 my time, 11:30 yours. 10 minutes from now, we'll be back. Okay. And it's being recorded, and you can support me on Venmo, Terry-Ryan-25, or send me a check here at the monastery. I think we'll put up the address someplace so that I can pay my bills. Thank you. We'll see you in a few minutes. Okay. Well, let's see who came back. Oh, looks like most everybody, at least they've not left us yet. We have 4 chats. Suzanne had to leave. Okay. 10-minute break. Venmo. Okay, there's the Venmo address and St. Benedict's address if you want to support me. Well, as everybody's coming back, I have just a little quick story. Of one of the things that you get with contemplative practice is you get more honest. And so I went downstairs to the kitchen, and there was an old monk there, and he was microwaving something. He took it out of the microwave, and it was a donut, a store-bought, sugary, heavily processed donut. And so I said to him, "Look at that, you're eating that donut, all that." And he says, "Yes, and I want nothing but." So no apology, he just wants to eat that donut. And that's the way it is. That's who I am. But he's 91 years old, and I don't think he's ready to go yet. So he must have genes for a lot of processed sugar. So who's going to be our timer? Aha!
I am.
He's got the bowl. All right. So I ask everybody to mute themselves. And Mary, you lead us in this 20-minute silent sit, okay?
Will do. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Amen.
Okay. Welcome back from a nice meditation. And glad to have whoever came back here. See if we have any comments or questions. Floor is
I had
open.
a question.
Yes.
During the years that I studied Hinduism, many of the yogis spoke about Jesus either coming to their country during those years, or that some of the elders or siddhas came to meet him. And this was also mentioned in the Oriental practices of the Tao. They also say that Jesus was a part of their lineage. And some people are put off by that. I love it. I think that, it's nice to know that the basis of spirituality is embraced in all cultures. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that during those years where Jesus was alive, but those years weren't documented.
Well, one thing that I keep in mind is that when he was raised with a body. He wasn't Casper the ghost. Now it was a resurrected body. So I keep that in mind. And they do say he visited 500 people. In other words, who they are, we don't know. But they have several in the Bible, in the Gospels. They have several statements about him visiting people, but we have nobody talking about it. So that's one thing I keep in mind. I think that a lot of our imaginations say, well, I mean, where was he for 40 days? He would appear here and there, as far as they knew, those ones who recorded anything. And so everybody's comfortable if it's recorded in the Gospels to people who saw him. Do they believe he was the second person of the Trinity? God, who knows what they believed. But they had an experience of his presence. And so I keep that in mind in terms of could he be anyplace else? But he could be any place he wants. It's us who say, well, if I can't do that, he can't do that. So if somebody has an experience of his presence, then that's their experience. And the idea that he's, once you get to non-duality, you break down the divisions that are made up by dogma. Dogma, on a positive side, is a way of explaining our faith in words and ideas. But it also locks us in, if you will, to I'm right. And if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. And that's why I think that the more contemplative is the more non-dualistic. And so if someone says, I mean, why do we say these three kids in Fatima said they saw Mary? And it's fine. Well, a lot of people say that's a bunch of baloney. They're delusional. That's just the way it is. So, because they were Catholic, and it was Mary, And she didn't see anything that we didn't already kind of know, or think we knew, or something new but connected to the old. It's all fine. But as soon as you're an outsider, as you say in whatever your tradition is, then you can't possibly have an experience of my God. I don't have any problem. In other words, God is free to do what God wants. It's not a Catholic God. Jesus was not a Catholic. He died a Jew, but he died, in other words, you are something in your non-duality. As a matter of fact, I think if people are having experience of Jesus, or say that are Hindus, or say that he's part of the Tao, it just says, well, God is everywhere. I mean, I think what's going to happen should we not destroy ourselves or go extinct? Should someday we discover another planet? Well, how are we going to express our faith if we set around a planet and they've got beings like us that have religions? In other words, you can get pretty crazy after a while if you narrow yourself down. That's why I think contemplative is not narrowed down. And so I think that Jesus went from the culture that was his given to an understanding of his much truer identity in that culture. So that's kind of how I see it. Someone asked the name of the book. What book? Mary.
The one that you, Elizabeth of the Trinities.
Always Believe in Love, put out by the Carmelites. ICS is the name of their printing outfit. Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington, D.C. I remember it when I was in the seminary. And this particular one was put out in 2017. So she's not as well known, but she is a saint. But I don't think she was made a saint until the early part of this century. 2002 approves the miracle needed for canonization. Pope Francis canonized her. So she's canonized in 2016, I think. October 16th, 2016. As far as I know, she doesn't have a feast day in the official calendar, but so she was made a saint within 100 years. That's pretty fast nowadays, unless you're well known. And, a Carmelite's not well known. There are none behind cloistered screens. So it's pretty good. My always recommendations to people, if I recommend a book and you don't like it, don't throw it away, put it aside. That was the way I first read Story of a Soul by Therese of Lisieux, her life. I said, this is so saccharine. This is a bunch of nonsense. Well, I wasn't ready for it. And I read it years later when I was supposed to read it. I said, oh, wow. So, if somebody recommends a book and I pick it up, it's not for me now, but it might be for me someday. I've had books like that. Well, okay. I'll maybe see some of you at 4:00 East Coast time, 2:00 my time on February 9th, a Wednesday. And then again, February 23rd, 2 p.m. My mountain time. It's the same Zoom. It always is. Chris will have it. This is recorded so people can listen to it. And it'll be sort of preparing us for Lent, reflections preparing us for Lent. Okay. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jerry.
We'll see you all later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for hearing.
Bye-bye.
want to say something.